Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Uncensored Critic podcast. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. It means the world to me. Thank you very much indeed. Today, we welcome a British theatre legend, a director by the name of David Leveaux. For anyone who is not familiar with David's work, here is a little bio for you. David directed Jesus Christ Superstar live in concert, broadcast on Easter Sunday for NBC, which received a nomination for the 2018 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Directing for a limited series, movie, or dramatic special. This is a small sample of his work in the theatre. He's previously directed Closer at the Donmar, starring Rufus Sewell, who was also Prince Andrew in Scoop for Netflix, Romeo and Juliet on Broadway with a certain Orlando Bloom, musical Backbeat in the West End, Jenny Wharton's stage adaptation of Through a Glass Darkly for the Atlantic Theatre Company starring Kerry Mulligan, including the world premiere of one of Harold Pinter's final works, Moonlight, at the Almeida, as well as the 50th anniversary of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead at the Old Vic with Daniel Radcliffe, Josh McGuire and David Haig. He's also directed for the Scottish National Opera and the English National Opera, with over 10 Tony nominations to his name, as well as Drama Desk nomination and Outer Critics Circle. This man is a true legend of the theatre. So, David, hello.
Hello, Oliver.
How
Good
are
to
you,
see
mate?
you. I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks so much for your time today, man. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Pleasure.
Yeah. So we start at the beginning with every guest. So for you, David, where did it come from, the love of directing?
Um, Oddly enough, I can actually pinpoint that.
Yeah.
um, I was, well, there were actually really two hinges. One was that where I went to school, we had a very enlightened and energetic English teacher who um, took some of us who wanted to go to Stratford to see the RSC, usually once a term if it was available. And that was an extraordinary period actually at the RSC because it embraced, it was Trevor Nunn's uh, sort of key period, really, I suppose, as artistic director.
Mm.
But it also embraced, along with Terry Hands, um, the Peter Brook Dream, which was, this now legendary production that happened in the White Box. And I remember him saying to me one day, "This is something you need to see." I mean, I was all of 14. And this was, you need to go and see this thing. And I luckily went, and I remember sitting watching this extraordinary production of The Dream in the White Box with two drummers up on a gallery and people on trapezes and doing magic tricks with spinning discs and a huge feather that floated, and not really having a clue what was going on with the play itself because I was 14 and really not that on top of Shakespeare, except that I recall thinking I never really want to be away from this place ever again, because it seemed absolutely magical and surprising and raw and sometimes rather frightening, um, and uh, and it just landed with me as this moment. um, I thought, well, how is that done? And so thereafter, all these other trips, we luckily took to Stratford to see shows there. I began to think about, um, so who's this person who's not on stage, who's behind organizing the whole event? And of course, like most of us, because I was interested in the theatre and attracted to it, I thought there was only one job in the theatre, which was acting, because that's the bit that you see, as
Mm.
a teenager. And so I tried to have a go at that myself, which I enjoyed very much, but I think instinctively knew even at the age of 14 I had a limited capacity for. Um, and Then one day this very same teacher said, because the school had a theatre
Mm.
or a building that acted as a theatre, and it got burnt down rather dramatically. And so he decided that, okay, we're going to do a school play this year anyway, and we're going to do it in this other school hall.
Yeah.
in a sort of improvised setting. And so I'm going to do it in the round. It's going to be As You Like It. And he said to me, because he knew I liked sort of playing the piano a bit. And, I had a couple of mates who played the guitar and somebody, was on the drums and whatever. He said, do you want to write the music for the songs? I mean, we were 14. Um, so I didn't know any better. So I said, yes, of course, I would love to write the music for the songs in As You Like It and the underscoring. So me and my two friends proceeded to do that. And because of the setup in that hall, we were right in the middle of the performing area, and the performing area sort of happened around us. And we did, I think it was like 4 performances of this. But I remember just vividly thinking, watching the overview of this show that was going on, that this wonderful teacher called Nigel Brown had devised with a bunch of 14-year-olds. It finally landed with me that actually that's the part of it, mysterious as it was to me, that I really want to get involved with. So I think it was like I was 14 or barely 15 when I announced generally that what I was going to be was a theatre director, which, as you can imagine, was met with a certain amount of caution but by those who cared for me.
Yes, yeah.
But actually turned out to be the case, very luckily for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you remember the first thing you ever directed that was from like your vision and you're the commander in chief, the very first thing you ever did?
Well, I wrote a play at school, which went on just before I left, and I was like 17. So it wasn't that I was directing it, but it was, well, funny enough, actually, it was the inauguration of the rebuilt theatre that had burnt down. And it was called, perhaps not fortuitously, No Time Like the Present, but 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 it gave me, this feeling of being sort of, again, it's the overview thing.
Mm.
And then I got a job at Derby Playhouse, really essentially as crew. Um, and before they let me have an equity card and all that stuff that you had to have. After which I started to get some kind of walk-ons at Derby, because that was my hometown, and that was the local rep. And uh, one of the actors who was in the company at the time, uh, Jeffrey Cassoon, it came to me and said, I want to do a one-man lunchtime show in the studio. Derby had a studio at that time.
Mm.
Would you help me with it? And it was essentially his adaptation of a Ralph Ellison novel called Invisible Man.
Mm.
Um, Jeffrey is a black actor. And so it's pretty extraordinary looking back on it, that he thought, oh, I know, I'll get this 18-year-old, what it was, to help me out, and we put it on, and that was the first time I kind of sat in a room, with a professional actor and a very fine one, and worked together on a one-man show involving Jeffrey in a chair, as I recall.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Just that.
And lucky. Oh, actually, I'll tell you something. Jeffrey said he gave me almost one of the best notes ever
Yeah.
as a wannabe director. He suddenly said, David, the thing is, if you want to be a director, you must never be about to do your first production. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you just have to give the general impression that there have been others before, because a lot of this is people just believing you're a director, especially early on. And I thought, oh, actually, that has never occurred to me, that you almost needed to present yourself as a director, almost before you really were, just simply, I guess, out of projecting a certain kind of confidence, I suppose.
Yeah.
Was the first thing, because it's a very delicate and difficult step, but you're stepping into the unknown anyway if you're deciding to become a director, and then it takes a while, of course, to find out, which theatre is yours,
Mm.
and make your own theatre, not, you know, try to make someone else's.
Yeah. I suppose like the question I'm just thinking about there was, like if we were to flash forward like to now and like the last few previous years, but excluding the COVID times when there were no theatres, sadly. But
Mhm.
like what's it like just before like opening night or the first well, I suppose more like opening night because then you get the press and the general public really in. But what's it like standing there like as the director about to open your show to the masses, to the public? What's that feeling like when the audiences start coming in on the first night?
Um, I will answer that properly, but I will tell you that it invokes a sort of classic director's nightmare that
Okay.
I once had, which was a dream whereby I suddenly realized on the opening night that there was one part that I hadn't cast. Uh, and
Really?
I then went hurriedly into the dressing room of an actor in this dream and said, "Would you mind? It's only like 120 lines or something. Do you think you could just sort of put that in?" And he went, "Oh, well, yeah, I'll give it a try." And the dream somehow cut to me being in the foyer of that theatre, as the audience came out for the intermission, and I was looking at their faces to see if they'd noticed anything strange. However, the serious. Well, I think most directors probably have a version. I know another director who actually has had a recurring nightmare about an opening night where he found out that the seats in the auditorium were all facing away from the stage. So I thought, oh, well,
That is
that's
unusual.
potent, isn't it? Isn't it? But I suppose the real answer to your question is I tend to uh, by that point it's almost as much about the company really as anything kind of personal to you. Because you hopefully by that time the company feels authorized in such a way as that they are legitimately and authentically and necessarily in charge of the event because it's a live event. Um, you work together, on the structure, the rhythm, all the things that we know go on in the rehearsal room.
Mm.
Um, but I think as a consequence, if I'm honest, along with the fact that you don't want anybody to get hurt by a kind of response, you don't want a thing to fail, you don't want, all those things that go on, and uh, obviously, when you get to Broadway, you're also talking about, you know, um, quite a lot of money being on the line and those things that are kind of
Mm.
realistic. But above all, um, you want people to come out of this, feeling elevated. And my abiding sense of companies on first nights is kind of one of awe, really. It's at that point when you kind of sit back and you go, it is quite remarkable, this job that actors, performers do, and the way they are prepared to connect with a live audience with the intelligence and the kind of monitoring lamps that are going on. How is the audience hearing this? Are they hearing that? All that stuff that's going on. So usually I feel a little sense of I suppose being slightly detached, and I don't mean in terms of, you know, my feeling of connection to the company and our work together. I just mean being able to uh, watch what this thing is
Mm.
through the eyes of an audience,
Yeah.
which is unique, and it's a privilege.
Yeah, I mean, but one thing that I've been fascinated with hearing director stories is, you know, how some of they'll sit. I think there's a story I heard about Simon Callow who was directing a show, and he the early sort of previews, early shows, he sat at the back of the stalls and was making lots of notes even after the show's already kind of up. And like when I was younger, I
Mm.
thought surely when they're open, that means everything's polished, nothing changes, everything's absolutely fine. But of course, now I realize later on that, you know, things are chopping and changing, like even
Yeah.
in previews and early shows and everything. So, I mean, what's that process like when you feel like you've got the show and then
Well, I think,
changing
yeah,
it?
that's really interesting, actually, Ollie, because because they're live, uh, obviously, that they're shifting, and they shift very often in direct response, obviously, to how audiences respond, and
Yeah,
that's a plus. In some cases, it can be like a negative, in the sense that um, it's very tempting, once something has got a laugh or whatever, to try to work that a little harder the next night, and suddenly, like, five, six, seven performances later, the laugh stops coming, and then you're very sort of confused about that. And the reasoning is because you know a moment has become pushed in a way that makes it simply not reverberate.
mm,
And I'm choosing a laugh, but it affects kind of all areas. Where things become overextended or overemphasized, and they lose their essential life. And at that point, there's a kind of moment of disengagement between the audience and the event, and that's something that you ought to be monitoring, as a director, because I think it's hard to do, as a performer, because you're trying. Part of your job is to try to elicit and feel a response from an audience. In fact, if you don't mind, I'll give you a an interesting example of that,
yeah, go.
with Harold Pinter,
Mm,
um, and when we did No Man's Land, at the Almeida, and Harold was playing Hurst in that, and Harold and I had this agreement, basically, that he would be in the rehearsal as an actor along with everyone else, and then on Fridays we could go and have a drink and talk to him as a writer. You know what I mean? And it was just kind of a way of
yeah,
maintaining as a kind of a practical thing, really. Anyway, we get to, well, beyond previews. Actually, we're into the run, and there's a moment towards the end of No Man's Land where I and it's a tricky moment, and I felt that Harold's character was moving on a little bit too quickly around the corner
I see.
with
Yeah,
this moment, and it needed a little bit more space for the audience to stay in touch. It needed the dust to settle, and then to um so as was normal, I would sort of go in and give notes to everybody, and everybody had notes. And at the Almeida at that time, there were only two dressing rooms, and Harold um, had taken one up to put his fridge for the champagne for hospitality, and so all four guys were in the other one. So whenever you gave notes to anyone, you had to go to the same room. So I go in there, and the guys are all getting ready for the show, and I'm going through a couple of things, and I come to this note, and I said to Harold, I said, can you just take? I think it just needs another beat there, before you move on. And Harold's first response to me was actually quite prickly, because he said, I said, well, look, David, I think what we learned, from playing with an audience is that we kind of really want to move it along there. And, and I thought, no, I have to resist this, because I can feel, just sitting amongst the audience, that actually we don't. So anyway, this is back and forth. And I thought I can't give ground here because it was the truth. I was trying to. So finally, I said, "Look, oh, sorry, is that? Do we have a copy of the script here?"
Mm.
And I think it was Dougie Hodge who handed one up to me, literally without. He had his back to me because he was sitting at his, dressing room table. Just handed it over his shoulder to me in a gesture that I thought,
He was
well,
prepared.
it was like over to you, mate, or whatever. And so I took this, I took the script, I went through it because I wanted to just be really, really clear about this particular line and why, And I got to it, and there, right in the place that I was talking about, I realized he'd written the word silence. And we can talk about this separately, but Harold's pauses and silences are,
Mm.
part of the architecture of his writing. So anyway, there was silence. So I said, "Oh, that's extraordinary," and I had forgotten this actually. And there was the word, and I showed Harold as well. It's funny because I think that's what I'm talking about. I can feel it, but it's not. And Harold looked at it and he turned to the other guys and he went, "Well, what the director is telling me here is when the playwright wrote silence, he bloody well knew what he was doing, and I shall observe the note." And that was, but actually, on the serious side, it was a very interesting example, but both about Harold Pinter as a writer who understood the practicality of how the theatre works, the communication between uh, the actor and the audience, because he himself, began as an actor. And so there's a very kind of like practical aspect in his writing, and these pauses and silences have a relationship to that.
Mm.
But it was also a case, where for whatever reason, he, as an actor, had fallen into a pattern that he felt was required by the audience, but actually caused us to be missing something of the experience of the play. That at that particular moment it just happened to be actually, I think, a pretty critical corner that the play was turning around at that point. But it was kind of an interesting example of that as
Mm.
well, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a good lead on to like some of the. I would want to talk about some of the incredible people you've worked with, like in your career, like in the plays. And I think that's a good point to start with. We'll start with Harold Pinter actually, because
Mm.
you were lucky enough to like work with the man himself and everything. And like I said in the intro, a brand new piece. Well, at the time, a brand new piece which he'd written after was it like 20 years away from playwriting or something. It was a considerable break, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was a I don't know if it was 20 years, but it was a long period since he'd written what you know critics like to refer to as a full-length play, whatever you kind of mean by that. So I
Yeah,
don't
whatever that
think
means. Yeah.
he, yeah, but I don't think he ever. I could never say of him that he'd stepped away from writing plays. There was a point towards the end of his life when he consciously did
Mm.
and said, "I just want to write poetry." But I hadn't sensed from him that it was that he'd stopped writing. It's just that he wasn't choosing to write quite in the same way. But it is true that when we were doing No Man's Land together, he hadn't had uh, a he hadn't written a new play of the same kind of moment as Homecoming, Caretaker, Betrayal.
Yeah.
In some time, and I don't know if it's true to say, but I think I sensed it was the fact of being in a rehearsal room as an actor and then hanging out with the guys in the dressing room, the whole process of you know making theatre reignited something in him again, because he was never, if I can say this, a literary or only literary or only theoretical figure. There was something that Harold kind of needed about his lifeblood, was to do with a practical moment in the theatre. And so I think that triggered something because in the time between when No Man's Land came off at the Almeida, and when it went on for a run in the West End,
Mm.
um, he and Antonio went off on a holiday during which he wrote Moonlight, and nobody knew about this until he came back, and it was, I think, like the first day. Well, actually, it was before the first day of our new rehearsals for the West End production. He called me and he said, "I've written a play." I was like, out of the blue.
Okay.
Really, uh, you know, uh, and how extraordinary,
Yeah.
and brilliant. He said, "Yes, I'll bring it for you," um, and he did. In the rehearsal room, came up to me and with a brown envelope to contain Moonlight. Um,
Yeah.
and there it was, a new Harold Pinter play.
Wow.
It was incredibly exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how did that feel for you? He'd entrusted you for his brand new play. I mean, what was that feeling like?
Well, I didn't actually jump to the conclusion on it at that point. He was asking me to direct it. I just felt really privileged that he wanted me to read it, and then of course, actually, stupid of me really, because obviously he was doing that because I think he wanted to know if I would do it. Um, and then I made one of those incredibly stupid mistakes, I suppose, that you know one can make, which was I was so, of course, eager to read it, so fascinated. After our rehearsal day, I went back home, read the play, thought this is really remarkable, and the excitement of sort of feeling like one of the first people in the world to actually have contact with this new play by Harold Pinter
Mm.
was incredible. And there was also something slightly disturbing about it to me, which was that there was this character of this young girl uh, who appeared at various moments, who was the sister of these two
Yeah.
brothers.
Was that
Uh,
Bridget by any chance?
Bridget, yeah, and there was something about it that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I knew it was disturbing, so I thought, well, I'm going to read it again. And by this time, it was, I mean, it was only like 10:30 or whatever, and I thought, I'm I'm not going to call Harold at this time in the evening. I'll call him in the morning. Incredibly stupid, because of course I call him in the morning, and actually it was Antonio who picked up the phone, and she said, "Oh, oh, I'm so pleased you called because he's been kind of really anxious, and we want to go to Scotland for the weekend or whatever, but he didn't really want to go until you called him and said, oh, I'm so sorry, I just never could, But of course he needed to know. He gave me his play. It doesn't matter if you're Harold Pinter or whatever. He needed to know, and
Yeah.
so I spoke with him and said, look, I think he's absolutely magnificent. And the one thing I hid from him was the conclusion I come to overnight was I didn't say hit from him. I just didn't mention because it's the sort of thing that I sort of got used to not mentioning because it was if you like, it was interpretative in a way that might not have been helpful. But I think what it is that's disturbing me about Bridget is that I think she's dead. It's never stated in the play.
Mm.
It's never, but I'll just keep that to myself because that's something that might inform the way we do it, from when we do it. Uh, and then so Harold said, uh, "Great, let's have dinner and talk about the play." So I duly went over there a few days later, and we're like halfway through dinner talking about the play when he suddenly says, "Listen, there's something I think I need to say." I'll put my cards on the table a bit because he said, "I think Bridget is dead," and I said, "Oh, thank God you said that because I was that was so my instinct." I just didn't want to say it because you might think, well, that's a bit of an imposition, on the play. And a few moments later, he said, you know, I realized I think I may have made a mistake. Uh, I need to look at this because in the character list at the beginning of the play, the boys um, were, I think, 17, 18 anyway. But the point is, you had a history of these boys, getting older over time, basically was the thing.
Mm.
And he'd done the same thing with Bridget.
Yeah.
And he said, of course, Bridget doesn't get older. She is the age she was, when she died. That's a mistake, and I need to correct it.
Wow.
That's amazing to watch that happen, in that moment. But also, um, I was very happy that, at that time we had worked very closely together on Betrayal, on No Man's Land. So I suppose I was tuned in, in some way, to the territory of his plays and the song of them, I suppose.
Mm.
Uh, and I felt excited to be sort of confirmed in that by, having this instinct from reading the play
Mm.
about Bridget in this case, and then Harold confirming it completely kind of independently.
Yeah.
Because he was not given with his, as it were, existing plays to saying
Yeah.
what I meant was this or what he didn't say things like that when he was in the rehearsal room. The way he would couch a note or a suggestion would be, what seems to be happening here is. So, you know, he was, and that gave rise actually to something that I think I've actually talked to a journalist in the Independent about, who's doing a piece on Harold, and said, look, I think you need to understand that when Harold's in the rehearsal room,
Mm.
he almost visits his plays as a tourist. He doesn't fully trust even himself
Mm.
to say, unequivocally, this is what I meant by this.
Okay.
So it's a bit, and I took from that the fact that Harold essentially wrote in an open stream from his unconscious to the typewriter, as it were, to the page. And then when he'd finished writing, it was like the door slammed, and he can only kind of vaguely recall the path back. So in rehearsal, it was like he was revisiting this path, but with a torch, dimly finding his kind of way up the road.
Yeah.
Um, and as a consequence, what became one of the great sort of myths about Harold is that he was, um, you know, almost too pedantic about every word being kind of exact. You go, well, any writer would want their words to be accurate.
Mm.
But part of that with Harold was he was defending the writer, in saying, look, I don't feel myself entitled to change something that was written for a reason at the time that it was written. And I'm also not necessarily going to then be, as I say, unequivocally authoritative about what the writer meant at that point.
Mm. Ah, it's
I mean,
interesting.
it's a really, really interesting.
It really is, yeah. And it made me think about you mentioned there No Man's Land, and of course you directed Harold as Hearst at the Almeida and
Hmm.
everything, which sounds amazing. But I think there's this divide in No Man's Land. I mean, I'll ask you, do they know each other, Hearst and Spooner?
All right. So my answer to that is, uh, um, it was my firm belief that there is, in general, in all of Harold's plays, no world or history that exists outside the room that you're in. And I once said this actually to the whole cast of No Man's Land, because I think Gore, Granger, and Dougie uh, had a they had, for very good reasons, they'd invented a whole backstory about their two characters that, involved a trip down the King's Road in a convertible or something that happened before. And I said slightly tendentiously at one point, I said, no, but the thing is, you're not there until you walk on. And the reason I said that was because I didn't, there's a problem if you carry a certain baggage of history in Harold's plays, a baggage of history through the door onto the stage, because immediately there's almost a loss of intensity. It's almost as if actually he wrote in the character of a dream, whereby, and by dream I don't mean something vague, I mean in that the intensity of presence that happens in a dream, the way you can have a dream that cuts here, it doesn't have a life off stage.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that if you're playing those parts as an actor, you might want to decide, have we met each other, have we not? It's just something that I almost discouraged in the rehearsal room, because I felt then you're working at implying something that's not necessarily supported by the present tense vividness of the language. And that flies completely in the face of, I suppose, received knowledge of how an actor has to approach, a role. But I felt it was really unique to Harold's way of writing.
Yeah.
And so the more you kicked away the bridges of history, the more the thing comes into focus. And by the way, so does history. And it's a particularly, I think, almost unique characteristic of his writing that makes me avoid answering your question.
We'll leave it up to interpretation. No, that reminds me of, I think it was in your production of, I don't know if you remember this, but it was in your production of Moonlight. I think it was, you had Anna Massey in rehearsals with you. Yeah. Who I don't think she's with us anymore, unfortunately. But
no, I think not. No,
unfortunately not. But bless her. But I heard the story that she said to Harold. There's a few others. Her and Claire Skinner have a similar story actually. They say Anna Massey apparently said, Harold, where have I come from before I come on into the room at this point? Where have I come from? And Harold just went, well, the wings. And Claire Skinner was another one, said, Harold, what do you, this bit here, I don't quite understand it. What do you mean by all this imagery? And Harold just said, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, that's a very good example. And he wasn't being enigmatic. He was being realistic. I mean, Bridget tells a story in the end. It sort of culminates with being, a story about being invited to a party by her parents and arriving outside a big house and seeing all the windows alight. There are people inside, but she never gets to go inside. She ends up waiting in the moonlight. I mean, the title comes, and it's
interesting.
By any standards, you would have to say, oh, that's an incredible account of somebody feeling separated by death, which is what's really going on in the play in general. That's obviously essentially it's also to do with the character, Ian Holmes' character, and that whole, because he's in his deathbed. And what that does is, when Harold sort of refuses to give you scaffolding around something like that, I actually think that's a great positive. I vaguely remember because it's so long ago now, but working together with Claire, for instance, on because she was so isolated from the others, but she was sort of it was this beautiful Bob Crowley design. Um, and she was like upstage of everybody on this slightly higher level. There was just a huge vase of lilies, and she was moving around in the dark.
Yeah.
And I kind of worked together with Claire on pacing, really. Just so let's just try these different ways of walking in the room. How does she walk in the room? And I know that sounds sort of like odd, but it helped. It suddenly these speeches became possible for her in a different way because she was walking, um, which were not possible if she wasn't.
Mm.
Um, and I think that was something to do with the voltage, the nature of the writing, um, and it was like a sleepwalker. It was something kind of restless, whatever. There was a whole combination of things, but it what I'm saying is that Harold's sort of refusal to answer those questions threw us all back on, um, other ways to, I suppose, embrace the life of a character, of a moment, of a piece of writing, which turned out to be really fruitful
Mm.
and very, very interesting and very specific. Um, so I would say by the time we got to Moonlight, I was absolutely, rehearsing that from the point of view that I've started to describe with No Man's Land, that you need to understand this play as if it were a dream, and you need to let an audience come into this as it were a dream, meaning that everything is intensified and not necessarily put in the familiar order
Mm.
that we assume reality is. Um,
Mm.
it just sort of reminded me because it was so exciting, working on a play for the first time, because this thing is coming into the world, for the first time, and it's by Pinter, and
Yeah.
that was, I think, a lot of us, we all felt, without that becoming kind of like solemn, I think we all felt a sense of the excitement of that, and the fact that you're, coining a new language, lots of ways.
Yeah.
So there's this moment when Ian's character suddenly, and it's the only time he gets out of bed, he was wandering around in the dark, and obviously you sort of realize he's so ill
Mm.
that he's been forbidden from drinking and doing anything that was
Mm.
although again it's never directly stated in the play. So we've got this moment, and we're trying to figure out how to do a transition from, and I kind of feel like I just haven't got this moment right where we're going from like his world of stumbling around in this room, saying, bollocks to them all, bugger them all. I mean, it's like, and then he goes back to the boys in their separate space in their
Mm.
beds. And I said, oh no, I think we need a light cue here. There's something about the transition there that's actually making an audience feel that we've concluded something that hasn't concluded yet. So whatever. So while we're working on that, Ian Holm in his pajamas is wandering around, and say we're in previews, so it's a rehearsal during the day, and he's wandering around in his pajamas, and he's doing the scene and everything, and he goes and he gets his drink out from the cupboard, and he's going, bollocks to them all, whatever. I'm sorry, I don't have the line exactly right. So bollocks, bollocks.
Right.
And then just the last minute, Ian just turns back to the cabinet and goes, "Cheers," and then carries on. Now, "Cheers" was not in the play
Mm.
that time. Um, Harold was sitting next to me and instantly went, "Oh, he should say that." Oh, what? And so,
Okay.
so I was just, yeah, no, keep that in. And Ian said, I can't believe it. I just wrote a word by Harold Pinter. But it was because, he was such an extraordinary actor in so many ways, Ian, but
Mm. Yeah, he
it
really
was
was.
also, it was spot on. And Harold recognized it, and it was both funny and weirdly kind of macabre, and helped us with this moment. So, there was an instance. It had nothing to do with pedantry. It had everything to do with, what's alive here.
I mean, the fact that Harold, I remember reading some stuff like he was so rigorous about what you got to say, and I think from I read somewhere that he was a man who said, once it's done, it's done. There's no changes at all. No, the fact that he just said that, and now he can forevermore, Ian in the next life can say, like, yeah, he did that. He had a line in a Harold Pinter play, and I mean
No, absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
that's that's something not many people can say. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
No, and what you just said there about Harold, once it's done, it's done.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. That he knew and he honored the source from which the writing came,
Mm.
and he uh, and he wanted to protect that. There wasn't any kind of. It was never pedantry. It was never like for the sake of it. In fact, the first day of rehearsals for Betrayal,
Mm.
which was the first play of his that I did, and we did, conventional read through round the table at the Almeida, and Harold was there. And at the end of it, I turned to Harold and said, Harold, is there anything you'd like to share? And he said, well, thank you, first of all, about these bloody pauses. And, oh, this will be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah,
He
I was
said,
just about to ask you about that actually. Yeah, the pauses. Yeah.
yeah, he said about these bloody pauses. If you find one that's not helpful, was not working, don't just ignore it. Don't. And so he was sort of giving permission, not to get hung up on something for some sort of literary device, because that was, him. He was absolutely, he was a practical maker of theatre. Um, but the part two of that is that in the process of rehearsing Betrayal, we never did find a pause that wasn't useful or that didn't work. And part of that was simply the accuracy of where they were and why he'd written them.
Yeah. I think a question I had for you about pauses actually, I'll just preface this with a story that I think you told, which if people thought there were too many pauses, you remember I think, did you say to Harold, there's a chance that this could become, quote, Pinteresque?
Yeah,
And
I
we
did. Yeah,
and Harold said, oh good God, we don't want to, no, we don't want that, do we? We don't
he
want
did.
that.
He
Yeah.
did. Yeah,
And
that was
yeah.
a run through of No Man's Land, and it was like a
Yeah.
first run through, and there were pauses popping in there all over the shop, which actually weren't in the script and were not useful, and made everything seem incredibly enigmatic. And that's why I raised that, because I knew that he had no interest in things being enigmatic. He did absolutely defend himself and the company on the basis of, well, David, this is our first run through. And I said, yes, I know, I understand that. But the reason why I'm bringing this up now is because these things can become, very, you can start falling in love with pauses and silences,
Mm.
particularly in writing like this. And it can be very harmful. And then we'll tip over into enigma, and that's when I said, and into it being Pinteresque, and
Yeah.
that's when he said, "Well, good God, we don't want to do that."
No, we don't. Okay, I'll do what you say. I'll do what you say. But again,
I
there's
think
a
it was just, yeah. Sorry.
yeah, exactly. There's a question I've got here, but there's another quote of Harold's again where he says, I'm probably not going to get this right, but I'll give it a go. He said, "Beneath the word spoken is the true feeling unspoken," or something like that. And a
Mhm.
question I thought was, it's kind of two in one, really. So I'll try and sort of articulate this. It was how important are silences and slash what can what can silences tell us without saying anything at all?
Yeah. So um, I my answer to this when it comes to Pinter um, is first of all, there's a distinction between a pause and a silence. Um, and that, and he's always quite specific. I mean, hence that moment, as I said, in the dressing room, when I was saying, no, no, you have to take more of a beat there, and it turned out to be a silence, not even a
Yeah,
pause. Um,
longer.
so, yeah, it needed longer. Um, and I kind of developed a shorthand for myself that I'm a little bit sort of cautious of repeating because I don't even know that it's true. It was just helpful to me at the time. Um, which was that basically a pause uh, occurs when thought is still in motion um, in an exchange. And a silence is what occurs when language fails. And they are quite dramatically different in the way they occur in his plays.
Yeah,
And I,
that's
I,
brilliant.
and it Well, you know what? I don't know if it's brilliant or not, Ollie. I just know that it worked. It helped me understand
Yeah,
some things because I think a great deal about doing Harold stuff is that you is to do with orchestration, is to do with music, and rhythm because you know when the thing lands, it lands because it's organized rhythmically. And this is not to separate this from all of the paraphernalia of feeling the unspoken, all
yeah,
those things, all of that. It's not to say it's not some theoretical thing. It's that um, you can just feel when a thing comes into focus. It's not even intellectual. It comes into focus. Uh, I mean, I think of an example. Uh, Betrayal is full of them. Is a sort of like an absolute, fantastic manual on where he's used pauses and silences. Um, and there's a there's a moment. I think it's the beginning of scene 3 in Betrayal. You know how the play goes backwards in time. So
Mm.
you meet Jerry and Emma, and they're in a pub, and you don't know what the situation is, and after a moment you realize, oh, they were in a relationship, and then you find out it was an affair, and then and then you meet Jerry's best friend, who's Emma's husband, and so on and so on and so on. So because it's going backwards in time, I think scene 3 of Betrayal is actually the breakup of Jerry and Emma, and it happens in this small flat that they've got. Um, in Hampstead where they have secretly been meeting up, and there's this whole thing that goes on in the play so brilliantly where um, uh, Emma keeps trying to just without mentioning it turn the flat into a home,
Mm.
um, and Jerry keeps referring to it as a flat.
Mm.
It's just one of those areas that is so brilliantly observed.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an exchange, and I won't even try to kind of repeat what it is, but there is an exchange right at the top of that scene, and it begins with a silence. The two of them are in that flat. They're apart, they're separate, they're not speaking. Uh, and I think Jerry says something like, What would you like to do then? Leading up to a scene. Uh, and anyway, eventually she says, I just don't know what we're doing anymore.
Mm.
That's all. And after she says that, there is a silence. Right?
Mm.
Now, one day in rehearsal, Harold came in, brilliant Cheryl Campbell playing Emma, and it was sort of fairly early stage rehearsal. She said the line came out as, I just don't know what we're doing here anymore. And Harold immediately went, oh, actually, that's not the line. The line is, I just don't know what we're doing anymore. That's all. Not doing here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Now that sounds like a trivial distinction. It's not actually, because when you think about it, it it is quite possible to come up with an albeit evasive answer to I just don't know what we're doing here anymore, because you could say, well, because we're having lunch, we're doing whatever. But if you say I just don't know what we're doing anymore, that's all. That is the moment where no evasions become possible. It's a challenge, that she makes to
Mm.
Jerry. And because there is no option, there is no available, it's not even possible to lie. That's why there's a silence. And that's why language fails. And he's written it. So you wouldn't have the silence if you didn't have that line. And the line that Cheryl just purely accidentally out of, because it's perhaps a more familiar thing to say, wouldn't have done the same job.
Mm.
It's that specific and true, I think.
Yeah, and that's like a really brilliant way of looking at it, David. It really is. It's like a masterclass on Pinter pauses and silences right
Well,
there.
well, I don't know. I mean, I know that okay. So here's the thing, and I have no pretense to any particular specialist knowledge about how you do Harold's, because everyone has to do it the way they do it. I just know
Mm.
that was my experience of it, and I've since seen you know a a brilliant director's production of Betrayal in New York that didn't work at all.
Mm.
And then found out that he had said at the outset, well, let's just ignore the pauses. Well, okay, I understand why you're doing that in terms of freedom, but actually it's kind of having the opposite effect, because
Yeah.
the pauses have a job to do, which helps you understand, uh, you know, I suppose, I mean, the example I've just given you of scene 3 of Betrayal
Yeah.
is a question, is a moment where crisis literally occurs in front of you.
Mm.
There's no softening of the edges of it. She, Emma, at that moment compels a moment of honesty. And actually, in the silence that follows, uh, you think, and Jerry think, this is over.
Mm.
Not okay. Well, we might be able to kind of no. And
So
it's
specific,
really
isn't it? It's so
it's
specific.
specific. It's
Yeah.
absolute specific. Yeah.
Yeah. And without, and again, it shows that in life in general, sometimes life isn't all blah, 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 all the time. We have silences, we have pauses, we have everything. This is what real life is about, and in those silences, say so much more than what words could really articulate at all, which is the
And
beauty of Pinter.
you feel that, don't you? You can feel, um, as you say, Ollie, that you know, um, in some silences that occur, in rooms, whatever, causes them, there is so much um, energy flowing. It can be negative, positive, whatever. Um, and it's so eloquent. Um, but I think Harold was, a writer who completely mined how that worked, um, and the truth of that. And he was incredibly specific about it. And it's therefore a mistake to think that pauses and silences are all part of the enigmatic, Pinteresque landscape. They're not. I mean, I actually once said to him, I wrote to him, I think, and said that I just felt he was in complete command of the facts. That was Harold nature, whether he liked it or not.
Mm,
You know,
it really
um,
was. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
fantastic work. Yeah, honestly, it's just sublime. It's absolutely sublime his work, and it's fantastic to hear that from someone who worked with him very closely and everything, man. It's
Mm.
it's unbelievable. All right, I want to turn our attention to another brilliant playwright's work which you've worked on, and of course that is Tom Stoppard. And you were, as I said in the introduction, in charge of the 50th anniversary production of that play at the Old Vic. Um, and I just want to preface this, starting with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, with this story because it starred Daniel Radcliffe and Josh McGuire. And there's a brilliant story which Daniel himself told at a Old Vic interview. It's on the stage, it's on YouTube, guys. Go check it out. It's a wonderful interview. He told this story about there's a speech early on in the play where Rosencrantz says it's about toenails and fingernails and how the beard and toenails grow after you're dead. And Daniel said, they're dead. So this plays about the afterlife. This plays about the afterlife. This is what it's all about. It was a huge breakthrough. He said, I went up to David Leveaux and I said, David, they're dead, aren't they? That's the thing. And you just went, what's the title of the play, Dan?
Yeah. No,
And it's
no, I
like,
remember.
ah, yes, yes.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
remember that. Yeah. That's I mean, chiefly Dan and Josh, luckily and essentially, had such a great sense of humor in that
Mm.
way and were so kind of playful. But it was one of those funny moments when you sort of go, I think Tom was in the room at the time, and
Oh, was he?
yeah. And I mean, it's not even like, Tom would sort of never go, um, yes, it's about mortality, because he sort of would feel like, you need to talk about that. But equally, it was a very proper sort of thing for Daniel to bring up, because he would just say, oh, this could be helpful perhaps to us, in some ways. And I think I was saying yes. In a way, my response to that was to say, yeah, well, don't worry about that, because that'll take care of itself. We don't, it's not, and it's also, by the way, in the title.
Yeah, it's in the title. It's in the title.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so tell me
I
about
think,
yeah. Sorry, go on, go on.
no, I was going to say, I don't know why it's not really connected to that, but it's something that Tom said that really uh, I thought was so funny, so brilliant about when we were doing a Q&A thing together, actually, at the Old Vic, and something came up about the poster. I mean, this was all to do with expectations of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and how to approach it now versus, I kind of first about 50 years ago. And I don't know how it sort of drifted into this not totally serious conversation about, how would you kind of describe the play now, kind of on the poster. And Tom went, well, I suppose funnier than Hamlet. which yeah, yes, exactly. um
Yeah.
so, so yeah, it was, I mean, I'm glad in a way you introduced that like this. Say it was the 50th anniversary. It was that was the kind of excuse for it. But equally, I think I knew Tom of course knew, and we talked about it. Said, but we can't do it as an anniversary production. It's not a museum piece. It has to be. We, you know, as is the case, whether it's 50 years on or not, you're in the business of renewing the contract between the player and its audience.
Yeah.
That is essentially what you're doing with any kind of revival. It just happened to be kind of extraordinary, really. That it had been 50 years since that play had kind of leapt into, and with it, its writer,
Yeah,
had
exactly.
leapt into public consciousness in the way that
Yeah.
it did
But
in that theatre.
I think Tom was 27 when he wrote it, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Something.
something like that. The 20s. I
Yeah.
mean, incredible. Yeah,
It's amazing. It really is. But how
yeah.
did it? Because I think the current artistic director, Matthew Walkus, was in charge. I think it was in his second or first term, I think, at the time. How did it come about? Did Matthew get in touch with you? Did you get in touch? Did Tom call you? How did you get involved in the project?
I think it was Matthew called me actually, because he'd been talking to Tom about it, and Tom, um, because by this time I'd directed The Real Thing, and Jumpers, uh, and Arcadia actually. So that
Mm.
and I think it was Tom had said to Matthew, uh, "Shall we ask David, to do it?" And Matthew, who actually, as a complete side note, was once my assistant at Stratford-on-Avon. So, that goes to show you can't crush everybody,
No, not
But
everyone, no.
especially as talented as Matthew. But anyway, so yeah, that's how that came about. And I think it was, you know, because Tom, thankfully, enjoyed, our process of working together and thought, okay, that's who I'd like to be in the room with.
Yeah,
So of course I said yeah.
absolutely.
And then immediately thought, wow, this is it's a challenge in the modern era, because as I say, it was important, and I didn't feel the play was, and I don't feel it is. It's not a throwback to some, like, you know 60s period piece, however brilliant. It's an extraordinary, and quite sort of radical, funny, um, exercise in addressing mortality from somebody in their 20s.
Mm.
Although that was a theme, I think, that was often with Tom.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, and I think I suppose like really, but my sort of questions about your practical approaches as a director, and everything, because you've got, it's a huge honor which you were given. 50th anniversary. We want you to direct all this stuff. So when you mentioned just there, like, this isn't a museum piece. We need to renew the contract and stuff. So what were like
Mm-hmm.
your first steps? Thinking, okay, 50th anniversary. We need to renew the contract with the this play's contract with audiences. What like the first steps that you took to sort of say, okay, how am I going to approach this play?
Yeah, good question. I think, uh, okay, number one, I'd say, which has always been my note to self when working on Tom's material, is that, um, beware of cleverness.
Mm,
There's a thing, and it's easy to fall into this trap because of Tom's incredible facility that we know of. And of course, in the early days, that was what was most celebrated about him, was being this, verbal gymnast, and being dazzling and brilliant and all these things. And yet, actually, I'd sort of felt after, the other experiences of work on The Real Thing and Jumpers and Arcadia, that actually, if cleverness is what you're projecting, then you're kind of failing in serving where the plays really connect with an audience. Um, and actually, what Tom's kind of really up to. And so I'm going to use this word kind of advisedly, but I thought there has to be, um, a compelling innocence about the way this play is expressed.
Mm.
And then with that, the 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 cleverness, the linguistic subterfuge, the interplay of, of logic and all those things that are part of the pleasure of the play, they will work, but they won't be, the heart, the beating heart of the thing.
Mm.
And so I knew that we needed a Rosencrantz and a Guildenstern who could, without this being a construct, express that kind of innocence, albeit in a form of kind of bewilderment, I suppose.
Mm.
That they both they both needed to just convey that sense of bewilderment, which is both funny, childlike, innocent, and all those things, And so that was an absolute key in terms of thinking about how we would cast that.
Mm.
And I think the second part of it was, what to me is quite a thorny issue of the player, who turns up at kind of various points during the thing.
Yeah. It's almost like a waiting for Godot moment, isn't it? Suddenly these
Yeah,
players arrive. Yeah.
yeah. Well, as they do, as a way, so he's taken, the players from Hamlet, and since you're, as it were, in an off stage from Hamlet actually going on,
Mm.
is sort of where the landscape of this thing takes place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then, of course, the player becomes, the player king, the person. And it's a kind of really interesting character. And I suppose traditionally, he'd always been played as a sort of like, actor, almost 19th century actor manager sort of chappy who, which is, one way to go. But
Mm.
I kind of felt that wasn't going to resonate. And I also felt that, as I said to Tom, the thing about that character is that you really need to be pleased to see him. Um, as an audience, as opposed to sort of feeling like, oh, um, that pompous bastard's turned up again, it's kind of, while I was sort of enjoying. There's
Yeah.
just something about, and so it sort of came down to a casting thing. So, David Haig, obviously, we asked to do the player, and almost the first thing out of his mouth when he came to talk to me and Tom about it was, I don't think I can do that kind of actor manager thing, but I could give you a secondhand car salesman. And it was such a sort of brilliant insight, and gave us like an immediate, like, access to that part of the play in what felt like a very, new way.
Mm.
And then Dan and Josh brought their thing with them. And it was, it was playful. And this is the thing, when you do the play, and I have felt this before, working on Tom's stuff, and actually, I suppose it has a relationship to Harold, but in a very different way,
Mm.
which is that, um, when it's working, um, there's almost a silence that rises up underneath the dazzle of the language,
Mm.
which has an enormous power. And in this case, it is the silence of death. Now, that sounds like, if you're not careful, again, a little bit kind of pretentious thing to say, but in fact, it's a very practical thing. Something happens when you just get the right note of what I call innocence in that play, where the hand of the silent hand, that um the silence that Tom is not a fugitive from, um, but he has a very different way of acknowledging in his place, the way, Harold did. Um, and so it became a really interesting thing about, okay, so we're going to put death on stage while doing, End of the Pier, and enjoying the comedy and enjoying, these amazing, this amazing wit and all that. I it was wonderful really to go back to,
Mm,
after working on the other plays, to go back to that first one,
yeah.
and realize that it is no, and I don't use the word very often, but I think it is an absolute masterpiece
It really is. It is.
in that way.
It's a beautiful, beautiful play. I mean, wait for you,
Mm,
because it deals with so many different things: mortality, probability, death, existentialism, the arts. Life in general.
yeah,
There's so many layers to this, and of course, on top of that, you've got Hamlet happening in the background. And I think,
exactly.
yeah, and I think with your one, I think you had the actor playing Hamlet who I think there's one point where he was doing his speech behind Dan and Josh, and he was just mouthing to be or not to be, I think, behind him.
Yeah.
And you had that moment towards the end where they're on the boat, and then Hamlet just goes up to the top of the deck and just gets his sunglasses out and just goes like that. Just,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that always got a laugh. I would imagine every night, but
There was actually, yes, it was actually, we had some fun with that. And I think it was, there was this moment, I know that Tom did respond to, where that came about kind of almost naturally between Josh and Dan, where um, Hamlet was absolutely kind of in the middle of a soliloquy. Um, and it occurred, I don't know, to all of us really at the same point, that if you're Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and you know reason to know what a soliloquy really is, so equally you don't really necessarily know who is he talking to, and so there's this joke came about where Josh and Dan actually came down close to where Hamlet was to try to figure out who was out there, meaning us, the audience, because it hadn't occurred to them before that there was somebody out there. And it was just one of those kind of like theatre gags, but because it was sort of so invested in, the enjoyment of theatrical conceit and device, that Tom was taking pleasure in. He
yeah,
he really responded to that, and so we kept it in and slightly kind of pushed it, I think. Yeah.
yeah.
I just didn't have that strong memory of both those, both Josh and Dan wandering down stage and peering into the dark to see who he could possibly be communicating with. And also I told you something about the nature of soliloquy. Plus, it was one of those moments that an audience could be invested in because they're in on the joke.
Yeah.
And that is the key. That's what I mean, sort of go back to the perils of cleverness, which is you're not in the business of trying to, demonstrate or show off cleverness to an audience, because nothing can be more, alienating ultimately, because people kind of feel, they
Yeah,
get,
they see through that, don't they? Yeah.
well, yeah, or they're just made
Yeah.
anxious by it, or they feel, um, and uh, and that's why I say in the end, it's like Arcadia, which is about mathematics and all those things. I said, well, but the thing that really transmits in Arcadia is, yes, there's a great beauty about the world of mathematics and the way that's expressed in the play and all that. But the thing that transmits is the passion for knowledge. Um, that's what brings with it everything else you sort of get for free. And sometimes, with Tom, particularly as you get into more complex kind of philosophical passages or whatever, to be honest to those, you also need to allow an audience to be taking such pleasure from the moment
Mm.
that they can treat some of the stuff, as jazz, to be honest, which is just enjoy and hang on to those sections that reach you, and don't worry, don't become anxious about uh, what what goes past you, because there's something coming up in a moment. I mean, I suppose my way of saying this is that I always get the impression with Tom is that who could run ahead of you so fast, just because he has that kind of a mind,
Mm.
an extraordinary mind. But what I love, among many things about him, as a as a playwright, and but also as a sort of human, is that he'll be leading you up the mountain, of some thought, some possibility. And just when you think, I think I'm about to kind of, run out of enough kind of oxygen to kind of follow you, that will be the moment when he turns around and offers his hand to give you the next help up. It'll be a moment in the play where, a character does something as sort of innocent and naive as just what we've been discussing, which is like it's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern trying to figure out who the hell is that man talking to when he's giving a soliloquy. At that point, he relieves you of that, which is why Tom is one of those great, to me, one of his greatest achievements is his contempt for solemnity. Which is part of his campaign for seriousness, and I think from a completely different point of view, Harold was the same. Should I actually just tell you? I don't know if this is.
Yeah, go on.
It's only because as we've been sort of focusing on those two, and I don't know if this is helpful. It's actually now in the biography of Tom. Which I actually, I think is Hermione Lee's autobiography, which is that's a biography, which is it's brilliant. But anyway, it happened. There was a day when I got a call from Tom because they were in previews for Coastal Utopia at the National, that Trevor was directing. And Tom called me and said, this thing has just happened, which is that I've just invited Harold to the preview. Oh, no, Harold had called him and said, we're coming to the preview of Coastal Utopia. The National. And Tom said, so I said to him, oh, great. So why don't we have dinner at the Ivy after? And Harold had agreed to that. And so Tom was calling me to say, I suddenly realized, I put the phone down. I've just invited Harold for dinner at the Ivy. And I'm not quite sure that was such a great idea. So I'm wondering, would you like to come to the preview too and come to dinner with us at the Ivy? And I go, yeah, that would be great. Who wouldn't? I'd love to do that. Well, I put the phone down. I think, I think I could have made a terrible mistake there. What's this going to be like? So anyway, sure enough, I turn up at the preview. Trevor Nunn is not pleased, and I can't blame him. I think, what am I doing at a preview? And I'm in the back row because that's where the production line is. And
I can't see.
Trevor's thinking, what? And Trevor's sitting there and thinking, what on earth is a director coming in an early preview, on this? And I can't blame him, but I kind of know why I'm there, really. So we see the show. We go to the Ivy, and I'm sitting there and Antonia is there, and Tom and Harold, so this conversation starts up about Harold saying, "Look, talk about the play, which he obviously kind of enjoyed very much, and says, I don't think you need all that scenery. I think you could do less and whatever," which would be a very sort of Harold thing. And then Tom said, yeah, but you see, I also think that, especially at the National, audience should get its money's worth. That's its phrase, So you kind of need some kind of, visual thing that goes with it. And that was, so back and forth it went. And then Harold did something really, tricky. But very typical of him. He suddenly turned to me and said, "What do you think, David?" It was like I had to make a decision about whose side I was going to be on, and from the depths of my kind of panic, I said, "Well, look, to be honest, sitting here at this table is like sitting between the sun and the moon." Oh, so you did. I mean, two quite different things, and Tom said, "Oh, which one? Which one is which?" Which was I had completely opened myself up to that. This is getting even worse.
Yeah.
And I think Harold said, "I don't think he's going to tell us. I don't think." And so I finally said, "Okay, so Harold, it's like you can take an empty room and imply the rest of the world in the empty room. Tom, you will take an empty room and stuff the world in its entirety into it. Um, it, it's too, and obviously, really, what I meant was I thought of Harold as the moon and Tom as the sun. Anyway, for it's one of those moments you just had to be so careful. But I'm glad I said it in a way because at that point I thought, oh yeah, that's you know, they're both leviathans
Mm.
um, approaching the world and as great writers do, actually creating the world like before you, but in two very different ways. And Harold's instinct was always to remove and let implication work because and he knew how to do that. Um, and Tom was giving in this dazzling version of the world where things that apparently are not connected are connected right in front of you. He'll show you. So no, those two things can belong in the same room. You think they can't, but yes, they can.
Yes, they can.
That's now both of those, with their own contradictions, are so deeply human, and profoundly of the theatre, I think, and profoundly dramatic. Sorry, that was a long-winded version of that, but since we got onto those two twin tracks,
No, it's great to hear
that's
it,
my
man. No,
point.
keep it coming, keep it coming. I just want to just one of Tom's quotes that we talked about before we came on. He said, oh, I've written it down. Hang on. Laughter is the sound of comprehension.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it's something he said to me when we were doing jumpers at the National, because he was doing previews, and you know, um, so Simon Russell Beale
Mm.
is playing this philosopher in jumpers who's trying to, write a lecture, um, and it becomes this sort of incredible um, sort of game. Well, essentially, jumpers is about faith. It's can God exist or not in you, and it's Tom being a little bit skeptical of people who are so ideological that they insist on being um, atheists, whereas Tom's position is more, I think, agnostic or whatever. So well, that's going on. Anyway,
Yeah.
as ever, we're in previews, and there's a pause that Simon takes at some point, and Simon is a master of how you do those, and it bothered Tom, um, because he has, which is similar to Howard a little bit. It was this impatience of like, I'm worried about the pace, if that drops there, whatever, and also, you know, um, and he reacted to it, and he was sitting next to me, kind of in the Littleton in the dark, and he goes, reacted, and I think I just because I was, we're in previews, and I'm thinking, no, I noted that, and and I just put my hand up, and said, not now.
Shush.
and so yeah, and he said he got I thought this was a bit quiet next to me. Oh, so anyway, the next day we have a drink together in the theatre. He said, "Oh, I sense you a bit irritated with me, yesterday. And it's no, nothing to do with that. It was just that I know what you're talking about, but I don't think, noting about timing and rhythm and everything. I just think that was the moment. We didn't need that note right then, at that point, and it wasn't the way to do it, in my view. That was not, He said, no, I just want to be clear, in case you think I'm just being cheap, looking for the laugh. And that has never occurred to me. Why would that be cheap about you or cheap about a laugh, in the theatre? He said, no, it's just, I want to be clear that I think of laughter as the sound of comprehension. And that's how that, um, and what he meant was, look, when people laugh, it, it, it is because they recognize something. It is, it means it's not a moment of confusion. it's a moment of recognition, and it's very clear in the form of a laugh. I mean, if you wanted to get really sort of technical or academic about this, it's actually what Brecht meant by alienation.
Mm.
An overused word, and people think it kind of means some, because it's a bad word in English, I think, alienation. It's the same thing, which is when an audience recognizes um, a moment of absurdity or
Mm.
whatever, and something comes into focus. It's the young soldier in Caucasian chalk circle,
Yeah.
telling this young woman, "Oh, I'm going off to war," because he thinks it's going to make him more attractive to her. That he's a brave young soldier going off to war, and her response to that is, "Well, what use is that to me? If you get killed in a war, whatever." The point, it's written so an audience goes, "Oh yeah, how pointless is that?" The character didn't know it, the audience did. So I'm not saying that's a big laugh line in Caucasian Chalk Circle, but I think it's what Tom was talking about.
Yeah.
When people feel released, people laugh when they recognize something as absurd or foolish, or they see the absurdity in it,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that's the kind of playfulness that that's what he meant. And very serious things can be.
yeah. It's also like they can see the relatability of it as well. If it
Yeah.
matches their
Well,
lives as well. Yeah.
there was an interesting conversation actually that sort of went on from there. I don't know whether the same night with Tom, whatever, but because he said to
Yeah.
me, because on Jumpers we had a little jazz trio on stage. The whole sort of set was kind of strange ballroom, and there was a jazz trio. And Tom said to me, "Oh, I was just wondering, where did the idea of having the jazz trio?" Um, because there's a song at the end of the Dottie sings and all that, so it's not like the song is absent. No, but he said, to put the jazz trio on stage. I said, well, to be perfectly honest with you, I just thought for some people when they come to the theatre, it's Tom Stoppard, it's Jumpers. They may have some notion now that it's kind of about the existence or otherwise of God. Um, it can make people feel a bit anxious
Mm.
about whether they're going to keep up or not. And I know that's not Stoppard's intent ever. To, as I say, to leave, not to put a hand back, not to leave people behind. I said, so I just thought if you came into the theatre and you saw the light gleam off a double bass and a hi hat on a drum kit, it would sort of make you relax and accept what you were receiving, as what I've called jazz at some level. That actually then, kind of relieves you of that anxiety in such a way that you get access to the play,
Mm.
which is a similar thing. It's the what you call the relatability of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's absolutely true, and it sort of ties into just a question actually. I contacted Harry actually before today. I told him about I was interviewing your good self, and I said, was there any questions that he had to you or anything? And I've got it here. He said, please ask David this. He says, how do we keep alive the values and volcanic depth of feeling in plays by writers in previous eras, Shakespeare included? Things in the theatre seem increasingly in danger of being superficial in this new climate of inoffensiveness and conformity.
Mm. Oh, ask a small question, Harry.
I know, I know.
No, but I mean, there's a passion behind that. Listen, I mean, I
Absolutely.
think, uh, yeah, inoffensiveness is an interesting one because I don't think it's any part of the theatre to try to be um, always likable. I'd say that the key is in the theatre, morality is energy, and whether that's energy that you find comfortable or not comfortable, it must be energy.
Mm,
The problem with the inoffensive is it lacks energy because it's basically like a sort of complacency of agreement. And I think what we've lost is that kind of what is volcanic, of course, is the sort of the collision of ideas and the collision of the uh, the uncomfortable that illuminates human existence. And I think
Mm.
our concern to soften the edges of that is a problem. Is a
Mm.
problem, and it's a problem across the sphere in the national discourse, in the theatre, elsewhere.
Yeah.
I think that uh, there's the other thing. I think I would have said in answer to Harry to that is that it's a little bit what I've touched on. I've been trying to touch on a bit, and thinking about Tom as we've been talking about him is that I felt that there's been one kind of superficiality, one kind of surface thing that's becoming shallowness is a certain kind of cleverness.
Mm.
I sort of feel like there's a terrible danger in cleverness that runs shallow. So I feel like we're seeing this in the media at the moment. I mean, a lot of very, very sort of clever, very brilliant people. Working for the Guardian, the BBC, the whatever, and you think yes, they're all brilliant, but what is it about this addiction to shallowness? I mean, if you there's nothing quite so unnerving about somebody who sort of goes sort of brightly, oh no, but I'm so clever that I don't even have to sort of take your anxieties sort of seriously. When in fact, what's going on is before your very eyes is so serious. I mean, and I could without us getting into territory this is not really about, but I'm sitting in the United States of America at this moment. Something is going on here where it seems to be, there's a pretty clear um, dichotomy between, two possible choices,
Yeah.
that this country could make in the next few weeks. And I'm kind of amazed at the New York Times because the coverage of this is if somehow, um, you know, uh, Trump is sort of equatable with Kamala Harris or whatever. But yet it all sounds kind of very clever, very bright, very, like if you walked into a room and somebody would go say, oh, yes, I mean, I know you've got that kind of, yes, that liberal thing going, but actually the way the real world works is, and you go, no, I'm sorry, that is the danger of cleverness running shallow. The way the real world works is the volcanic thing that Harry's talking about and that Harold was doing, and that Tom, which is this thing that rises from the depths. Now, when it rises from the depths and is given access to by very clever people,
Yeah.
you get discourse. But I'm worried about the rise of shallow cleverness, and I don't know, because I think of the theatre, whatever form it's taken, comedy, tragic, whatever. Ultimately, um, if you do not, if you cannot honor innocence, then I don't know. As being at the core of that experience, that exchange between audience stage, whether you're doing Electra, as I did with Zoe Wanamaker a few years ago,
Yeah.
at the core of that tragedy is innocence as well. And I've used this word several times in our conversation. And I think it's because I'm trying to get at some moment of humanity where we go, look, this is where the the moral landscape is, and what our theatre can do, what the theatre can do better than anything is that fantastic moment of communal innocence where we face ourselves in our absurdity, in our isolation sometimes, in our sense of being outsiders, where for just that second, we feel our own strangeness is in fact what makes us part of this community, not separated from it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a battle that will continue, and
Yeah.
I think the battle, as I say, between um, uh, innocence and the wrong kind of cleverness is going to be one, is a dialectic that will continue,
Yeah.
but needs to be addressed always because people can people feel bullied by a certain kind of cleverness,
Yeah.
and you know what? That's tyranny.
Mm, it is.
And the reason why Harry's right, about we need to keep these these amazing kind of volcanic, huge, portrayers of the strangeness of existence itself. They are part of our natural immunity to tyranny, and we set them aside and forget about them or don't revisit them, at our peril. We
Mm,
keep we need to keep renewing the contract,
yeah,
with humanity. I mean, not to be too grandiloquent about it, but that's it.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's very, very well put. It's just the arts are fundamental to us. They show us
Yeah,
who we are, who we can be, who we have been, and who,
yeah,
where we are right now and everything. And it
yeah.
just shows everything else in between. So yeah,
And while we're not separate, we're connected.
exactly.
That's fundamental.
Yeah, everything is one, as they say.
Yeah,
It's good.
yeah.
David, I could talk to you for hours, mate. Honestly, I really, really could. I'm very aware I've taken up a lot of your time, but
No, you're welcome.
yeah, but I don't. I'd love to do another one in the future. I've still got so many more questions for you and everything.
Oh, well, anytime.
Yeah,
Oh, they just get in touch, and it's very nice to kind of meet you. And
yeah.
great good luck with it. It's a great project.
Oh, thank you, man. I
So,
appreciate that. Yeah, I've just got
no,
two quick fire questions left for you, and
yeah.
so just to finish today, the first one is, what would you say was a bit of advice you wish you heard when you were starting out?
Ah, um, am I allowed to answer that by saying, actually, luckily, this is a bit of advice I got when I was
Yeah,
starting out,
of course. Well,
because
yeah, even better.
as it turns out, because I was lucky, and it was from a man called Joe Chaikin, who was one of the principal architects of the Living Theatre, which was a famous progressive theatre company in the '60s, and they were doing a lot of avant-garde work, and Joe, became very connected to Peter Brook's work as well, and so it was very much, embodied that explosion of experimental work and new forms and all that. And he said to me, because I met him in New York, and he let me come to some of his rehearsals for a project he was doing at La Mama, and we went and had a beer one night kind of at the corner of the street. And Joe said to me, he said, "Oh, I've been thinking, because I know you want to be a director." And he said, "I think you will be." So I've been thinking, well, what kind of advice can I give you? And I was running through all the things we did as the Living Theatre, because we did anti-war protest. We turned on the house lights. We had the audience held hostage. We did nudity. We did almost everything we did is actually now in the mainstream. You can see it,
Mm,
on Broadway. You can see it. So I didn't think any of that was particularly useful. But then I remembered the thing that I think was our most important discovery in all of the work we did was we realized there's no excuse for an audience to leave a theatre with less energy than they came into it with.
mm,
And it's one of those wonderful kind of,
that's good. I like that.
it appears so simple,
Yeah.
but if you apply it, as kind of note to self or note to situation, that is it. And he was onto something about energy, and that's true and very hard to do.
Yeah.
It's very hard to do.
Mm. That's brilliant though. I mean, to have that at the start of your career as well.
I know, just to have that kind of language, you go, oh yeah, hang on a second, that's why
Yeah.
this is going wrong because it's doing the opposite. And we can be. I mean, Peter Brook puts this in different ways in The Empty Space and his other writing, which is, you can be as right as you like,
Mm,
but if ultimately uh, that can end up being a deadly thing if if
mm,
if the energy isn't released. It's that was something that Brooke understood, Joe understood. It's something you're in search of, beyond any kind of intellectual scaffolding,
mm.
and is a very serious and moral thing too. So when I speak about energy, it's not for affect. It's not about. It's about the moment when an audience is elevated by the scale of life itself.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah, brilliant stuff.
good note to self and a very hard one to rise to.
Well, you definitely have, man. You definitely have.
Wow. Well, okay.
Of course, you have. And finally, today, till next time, is what's been an experience or experiences you've had in your career up till now that you'll never, ever forget?
Well, I mean, so many of them we've been talking about, obviously just to be that close and work that closely with Harold and Tom, for
Yeah,
instance.
sure.
I guess I think there's something, yeah, probably if I was going to, it's Beckett. It's, this brief period when I was sort of in inverted commas assistant to him while he was directing Waiting for Godot
Wow.
uh, at Riverside. And, I was a sprog. My main job was to bring him half a Guinness at lunchtime. It's not like, but anyway, I get to, and I just, and there was this, and I remember thinking, oh, there's something which had surprised me. And I don't know why. I just thought there's something really kind of like gracious about this man. And I kind of wasn't expecting that because, all the stuff you sort of think also comes with Beckett.
Mm.
So one day I'm sitting with this Arthur Guinness and we're sitting there, and sometimes Sam would talk and sometimes not. And I see somebody come in through the foyer doors back at Riverside, and sort of wild haired. That's how I can talk, but looking slightly kind of, I thought, like evangelical or something, kind of.
Yeah.
And I thought, and I just instinctively knew, oh, this is somebody who's come in search of Beckett, who just knows he's here, and he clocked Beckett and started coming over, and I remember thinking, I don't know what to do. You know what I mean? Because I don't. On the one hand, it's not my business to sort of be in between anyone who wants to exchange with Beckett. But equally, I don't want anything to happen. Just to be practical about this. And this man comes up and he's standing shaking at the edge of the table, and Sam doesn't look up at all. And I don't know what to say, but finally, the man says, "Mr. Beckett, I've been reading your work for 40 years." And then he dries up, out of nerves or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
And he's standing there speechless. And I'm thinking, okay, how do
What,
we,
what now?
what
What do
can
we
we
do?
have? What now? So I've been reading your work for 40 years. And then Sam finally looks up and says to him, "You must be very tired." And I thought, in that moment, there were so many things collided about this giant of 20th century drama. I thought, you've completely nailed the joke. It's like, and you kind of helped this guy off the hook. I mean, everything about it was funny, absurd, and whatever. And I would say the second thing about Sam in that experience was witnessing something that just seemed so Beckett but so spot on. And
Mm.
Sam didn't even know he was being observed doing it. But I was just, he, a friend had brought their young baby in a pushchair and parked them in my office.
Mm.
So a little child was there with a banana. So, and Sam, he would call his wife during the day quite often because I think she was in hospital at the time. And he came in to use the phone on my desk in my office. And that was the deal. And the thing is, in those days, our phones were like rotary dialed things. Then you had to dial 9 to get through to
Mm.
the thing, and then they put you through and whatever. And I explained all this to Sam and everything. He kind of knew about it, but they weren't always that reliable. So anyway, I just discreetly withdraw to outside the office, but I'm sort of keeping an eye on events and things. And Sam, he started to dial, and obviously something's going on with the 9. I can see him getting visibly irritated. And finally, he just literally slams the phone, throws the phone off the desk because he's so irritated. The child in the pram with the banana notices this action. And in a split second, the consequence is that the child then throws this piece of mushy banana at Samuel Beckett. I mean, it's like this sort of moment of farce going on and Sam turned around and stared at this child, and I thought, wow,
God.
so is he going to be? And did this wonderful thing where he took that piece of mushy banana and threw it back at the child, who of course was completely illuminated with ecstatic hilarity, and it was a fantastic moment of genuine communication that went on between these two. That I thought, kind of, if I can say this, went to the heart of the matter.
It really, I thought you were going to say that was inspiration for like Crap's last tape or something in that moment.
Well, but it is, isn't it? But I just remember thinking, I don't know, there's something, what a privilege. There's something so joyous about that kind of insight into, as a baby and an older Beckett and the kind of exchange of humanity that went via this banana. I mean, and how can you not say what a privilege that is to witness a moment like that? And
wow. Because
so
you've got Sam Beckett there, like you say, one of the brightest minds of the 20th century, just throwing a mushy banana at a baby.
Best possible response, and the baby understood it completely, and they were speaking in the same sentence,
Yeah.
Same language. Beautiful.
Absolutely beautiful. What a moment. That's something else. Oh, and I think that's a good point to finish, David. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you, Ollie. Generous. No, it's my pleasure. And good luck with it. I'm glad you're doing this. And
it's great and everything. It's a real honor to have you along today, and I can't wait to have you back because I've got so much more to discuss. Everything cool. If you just hang on, cool. If you just hang on, I'll finish the recording and we'll have a little debrief afterwards.
I will do that.
Yeah, cool. So I won't keep you long. But for now, wow, fantastic stuff, guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This has been the Uncensored Critic podcast, and I'll be back very, very soon. And David Leveaux, thank you so much.